Growing up, I learned pretty early that my dad was not someone I could trust when he took my bike money at 10, my babysitting cash at 14, and every other dollar I ever saved with excuses about keeping it safe for me. Last year at 24, I logged into my high-yield savings account to find my $8,000 car down payment completely gone, and when I called him demanding answers, he said he was keeping it safe from the rough economy and that I should be grateful he was looking out for me. Growing up, I learned pretty early that my dad was not someone I could trust. When I was 10, I saved up all summer from mowing lawns to buy a second-hand bike. I kept the cash in a jar in my room. One day it was gone. When I asked him, he laughed and said, "Money in a kid's hands is like candy to ants. You'd just waste it." He claimed he'd invested it for me, but I never saw a cent of it again. When I was 12, my school was having a camping trip that cost $40. I asked Dad if I could use some of the allowance money I'd been saving. He rolled his eyes and said, "What do you need camping for? Sleep in the backyard if you want adventure." He later told relatives that I wasn't the type to have friends anyway, as if that explained everything. At 14, I babysat for neighbors and made about $200 over a few months. I planned to buy art supplies. Dad found the envelope in my dresser and took it, telling me it was for family bills. That same week, he came home with a new fishing rod and cooler. When I asked about the money, he snapped, "Don't be selfish. I'm your father. Everything I have is yours, and everything you have is mine." By the time I was 17, I kept my earnings hidden at my best friend's house, but Dad still found ways to humiliate me. If I bought something new for myself, like a pair of sneakers, he'd loudly ask in front of family, "So where's my cut?" as if my money was automatically his. Fast forward to last year. I'm 24 now, working full-time, and finally had managed to save a decent amount, just over $8,000. I had plans to put it toward a down payment on a car. I kept it in a high-yield savings account separate from my main checking. One weekend, I went home to visit my parents. My dad was in a weirdly cheerful mood, offering me a beer and talking about how proud he was of me for being responsible. That should have been my first red flag. The following week, I logged into my account, and the money was gone, completely. I panicked and called the bank, who told me the funds had been transferred to another account, my father's. I called him immediately, demanding to know what the hell happened. He didn't even deny it. He said, "Relax, I'm keeping it safe for you. The economy's rough. I don't want you wasting that on some stupid car. You're still young. You have time to save more." When I told him it wasn't his decision to make, he scoffed, "Don't talk to me like I'm a thief. I provided for you your whole life. You think $8,000 makes you independent? Grow up." I was shaking with anger. This was not keeping it safe. This was theft, and it wasn't the first time, just the biggest. I told him he had 48 hours to send the money back or I'd take action. He laughed and said, "What action? You wouldn't dare make this public. Imagine how selfish you'll look, going after your own father." That night, I decided I was done playing nice. I had access to some joint accounts he had added me to years ago for emergencies when I was in college. I never touched them because they were his, but now I figured this counted as an emergency. I logged in and found over $10,000 sitting in his checking. I transferred every single penny to my own account, including the exact $8,000 he took from me. I took screenshots of the transaction for proof. The next day, he called me in a rage. "You stole from me," he shouted. I calmly said, "No, I took back what you stole from me, plus interest. Consider it repayment for the bike money, the babysitting money, and every other safekeeping you pulled over the years." He tried gaslighting me, saying, "That was all for your own good. You never appreciated what I did for you." I told him I appreciated having a roof over my head growing up, but that didn't make me his personal ATM. He demanded I return the rest of the money immediately. I told him I'd think about it, but only after he wrote me a signed statement that he would never touch my finances again. He refused, so I kept it all. The fallout was brutal. He tried to paint me as the ungrateful child to the rest of the family. At first, a few relatives called to scold me, but then I explained what happened in detail. I reminded them of all the times growing up when I mysteriously lost my savings and how he always justified it. Most of them went quiet. A few even admitted they had similar stories with him borrowing money and never paying it back. The best part? A week later, I got a call from my mom, who had been quiet through all this. She told me she'd gone through some of Dad's papers and found where he'd been planning to use my $8,000. She pulled out papers showing he'd been talking to Tom Brennan at the dealership about buying a 28-foot boat for almost $9,000. The down payment was exactly $8,000, and the paperwork said the money would be ready by Friday, which was 2 days after he'd taken my savings. I stared at my phone screen while Mom kept talking about how she found the brochures hidden in his desk drawer, along with emails between him and Tom discussing delivery dates and marina fees. My hands were shaking as I realized this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing where he saw my account and grabbed the money. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months, knowing he'd take my money to buy himself a toy. After Mom hung up, I logged into my online banking and remembered those old accounts Dad had set up when I turned 18, supposedly for college emergencies that never got used. I typed in the login info I'd saved in my password manager and found 3 accounts I'd completely forgotten about sitting there with $15,000 total just collecting dust. I took screenshots of every single page, every transaction history, every account number, but didn't touch the money yet because I needed to understand what else he might be hiding. My phone rang, and it was Marcus calling from his apartment in Cleveland. Mom had told him about the boat thing, and he was pissed. He said he'd been keeping all his money in crypto since junior year of college when Dad borrowed his $3,000 student loan refund to fix the roof, except the roof never got fixed and the money disappeared. We spent 20 minutes comparing notes about all the times growing up when our savings mysteriously vanished, and Dad always had some excuse about teaching us responsibility or keeping it safe. Marcus reminded me about the time I'd saved up for art camp, and Dad took the money saying camps were for rich kids, then bought himself a new set of golf clubs the next week. 2 days later, I met Grace at our usual coffee shop on High Street. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old envelope with my handwriting on it from when we were 17. It still had Emily's babysitting money, $200, written in purple pen with a date from 5 years ago when I'd hidden it at her house. She'd kept it all this time in her closet, thinking I might need it someday as proof. And now here we were with actual evidence of the pattern. My phone buzzed with texts from Dad claiming I'd committed fraud and identity theft by taking his money. He said his lawyer would have me arrested within 24 24 hours if I didn't return every penny immediately. I noticed he'd blocked me on Facebook, but Grace showed me on her phone that he was posting about ungrateful children who steal from their parents, complete with old photos of me as a kid at Christmas, with captions about how he'd given me everything. Within an hour, I had 3 aunts and 2 uncles calling to yell at me about stealing from my father. Aunt Sharon said I should be ashamed of myself after everything he'd done for me. Uncle Pete called me a thief and said I was no longer welcome at family gatherings. I started writing down every message, taking screenshots, and creating a timeline of every single time I could remember Dad taking my money over the years. That night, Mom called me crying harder than I'd ever heard her cry before. She'd been going through their bank statements going back years and found that Dad had been taking money from their joint savings in small amounts, 200 here, 300 there, always just under what would trigger her attention. The total was over $30,000 that he'd claimed went to business investments that she now realized never existed. She found receipts for fishing equipment, golf trips with his buddies, even a motorcycle he'd bought and sold without telling her. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the screen as everything started making sense. I opened a new spreadsheet and started documenting every theft I could remember with dates, amounts, and whatever excuse he'd given at the time. The bike money when I was 10, $40. The camping trip at 12, $40. The babysitting money at 14, $200. By the time I finished, the list went back 14 years and totaled almost $2,000 just from what I could prove, not counting all the times I couldn't remember exact amounts. My phone lit up with a text from Derek, Dad's younger brother who lived in Dayton. He said he needed to talk to me privately about something important. When I called him back, he told me Dad had borrowed $5,000 from their mother last year, claiming he needed it for medical bills that Derek later found out never existed. Grandma was 82 and living on Social Security, but she'd given him her savings because she trusted her son. Derek had bank statements and withdrawal slips he could send me if I needed them for whatever was happening between Dad and me. The next morning I went to work but couldn't focus on anything. My computer screen blurred as I tried to type emails, and my supervisor Sarah kept asking if I was okay. I told her I had a family emergency and needed to take a half day. There's something really calculating about how the dad waited until she visited to steal that money, acting all proud and cheerful while he was already planning to drain her account. I sat in my car in the parking lot with my hands shaking, scrolling through my phone as more relatives posted comments on Dad's Facebook posts about how disappointed they were in me. My cousin Jennifer wrote that she couldn't believe I'd turned out this way. My dad's sister Helen said I needed therapy for my greed. Every single person was taking his side without even asking me what happened. My phone started ringing while I was still trying to process everything. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I picked up anyway. It was Tom Brennan, my dad's business partner from the marina. He sounded really nervous and kept clearing his throat before telling me that Dad had used my money as a down payment on a boat. Tom said Dad had promised him the money came from his personal investment returns, but now Tom was worried about losing his dealer's license if there was a dispute. He asked if we could meet and said he had emails and documents that might help me. I agreed to meet him the next day, but first I had something else to handle. Grace's mom had recommended a family lawyer named Sophia Davis Williams who specialized in these kinds of cases. I drove straight to her office without even calling ahead. The receptionist must have seen something in my face because she squeezed me in between appointments. Sophia looked over all my documentation while I sat there picking at my fingernails. She flipped through the bank statements and screenshots for about 20 minutes before looking up at me. She confirmed I had legal access to the joint accounts since my name was on them. She said Dad might try to file a civil suit, but criminal charges were unlikely since I was an authorized user. She also warned me to document everything from this point forward. 3 days later, Marcus showed up at my apartment with Chinese takeout. We didn't talk about Dad at all. We just sat on my couch watching old episodes of The Office and eating lo mein straight from the containers. When he was leaving, though, he stopped at the door and turned around. "I believe you," he said quietly. "I've always known what he was." The next Monday, I was eating lunch at my desk when the receptionist called to say someone was in the lobby demanding to see me. I went downstairs and found Dad red-faced and yelling at security. He started shouting about being a loving father betrayed by his daughter the second he saw me. Everyone in the lobby was staring as security grabbed his arms and started pulling him toward the door. My co-workers from accounting were coming back from lunch and saw the whole thing. My supervisor pulled me aside afterward and suggested I work from home for a few days until things calmed down. That evening, Mom texted asking if we could meet privately. We met at a park near her work the next morning. She looked tired and kept wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself, even though it wasn't cold. She told me she'd been documenting Dad's financial lies for 2 years because she was planning to divorce him. She pulled out a folder full of bank records and credit card statements. She even had recordings on her phone of him admitting to borrowing money from various family members. She said she'd been too scared to leave, but seeing what he did to me finally pushed her over the edge. Working from home the rest of that week was actually a relief. My supervisor sent me an email saying they'd banned Dad from the building and that security had his photo. A few coworkers texted to check on me and said they were sorry about what happened. It felt good knowing people who actually knew me were on my side. Then Derek, Dad's younger brother, sent me something that made my stomach drop. Screenshots of text messages between Dad and Mom from weeks before he took my money. In the messages, Dad wrote that I owed him for raising me and that he'd claim I stole from him if I tried to get the money back. He'd been planning this the whole time. Marcus and I met Tom at a diner the following Saturday. Tom brought a manila envelope stuffed with printed emails. In them, Dad bragged about having full access to my accounts and how I never checked them anyway. Tom had also recorded their last phone call where Dad admitted the money wasn't really from investments. Tom looked genuinely upset about the whole situation and kept apologizing for not realizing sooner. That night, I couldn't sleep and found myself scrolling through old family photos on my phone at 3 in the morning. In every single picture, Dad was always in the center with everyone else arranged around him like we were props. Even in my graduation photos, he'd positioned himself front and center while I stood off to the side. It was like we only existed to make him look good. Sophia called me the next week to say she'd drafted a cease and desist letter for Dad's harassment. She also filed paperwork to remove me from all the joint accounts going forward and helped me set set up additional security on my financial information. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was actually taking control instead of just reacting to whatever Dad threw at me next. 2 days later, I was sitting at my desk when my phone started buzzing with calls from unknown numbers. My stomach dropped when I saw an email from HR asking me to join a video call immediately. The HR director looked uncomfortable as she explained that my father had called the company claiming I was mentally unstable and had stolen money from my family. She said they had to investigate, but wanted to hear my side first. I pulled up every screenshot, every bank statement, every text message from Dad threatening me over the years. I showed them the cease and desist letter Sophia had drafted and the documentation of his harassment. The HR director's expression changed from concerned to sympathetic as she reviewed everything. She told me they'd need a few days to sort through this, but I'd be on paid leave while they investigated. I hung up feeling sick to my stomach. Meanwhile, Mom had been making her own moves. A week later, she called me from her sister's house to tell me she'd packed up her important documents and left while Dad was at work. She'd already filed for divorce and had the bank freeze all their joint accounts before he could drain them. She hadn't told him yet because she wanted to be somewhere safe when he found out. Grace showed up at my apartment that night with takeout and 3 of our friends from college. She'd organized a small dinner to help me feel less alone. As we ate, everyone started sharing their own stories about difficult parents. One friend talked about her mom stealing her identity to open credit cards. Another mentioned his dad showing up drunk to his graduation and making a scene. I realized I wasn't the only one dealing with this kind of family drama. The next morning, I decided to post my story online with all the documentation. I uploaded screenshots of the bank transfers, the cease and desist letter, and a timeline of every theft going back to when I was 10. Within 3 hours, it had over 500 shares. My phone started pinging with private messages from cousins I hadn't talked to in years. 3 of them shared their own stories about Dad borrowing money for emergencies that never existed. One cousin said Dad had asked for $2,000 for my college tuition when I'd actually had a full scholarship. Then Tom liked the post. Dad's business partner actually liked my post about him being a thief. The family group chat exploded within minutes. Some relatives defended Dad, saying family business should stay private. But then Aunt Patricia dropped a bomb by revealing Dad had borrowed $3,000 from her for my supposed medical emergency 5 years ago. I'd never had any medical emergency. More relatives started sharing their stories. Uncle Frank said Dad still owed him $4,000 from a business opportunity that never materialized. Dad found out about Mom leaving when he got home to an empty house and divorce papers on the kitchen counter. My phone lit up with 17 missed calls before a voicemail notification popped up. His voice was pure rage as he screamed about how I'd destroyed everything and he'd make sure I never worked in Columbus again. He said he'd ruin my reputation and make my life hell. I immediately saved the recording and forwarded it to Sophia. She texted back that this was perfect evidence for a restraining order. Derek called me the next day, asking if Marcus and I could meet him for coffee. When we got there, he looked exhausted. He'd discovered that our grandmother had been giving Dad $500 every month, thinking she was helping with family bills. She had no idea Dad was using it for his boat fund and gambling. We spent 2 hours gathering all our documentation to show her where her money was really going. Derek had bank statements showing Dad's spending patterns. Marcus had screenshots of Dad bragging about his poker wins online. I had the timeline of thefts and the evidence from Tom about the boat scheme. We agreed to visit her together that weekend. My return to work after HR cleared me was less awkward than I expected. Several co-workers pulled me aside to express support. One woman from accounting quietly told me her father had done something similar when she was in her 20s. She said going public had been the best decision she'd made. My supervisor assured me my job was secure and even offered to be a reference if I ever needed one. 2 weeks later, I started looking for a new apartment. I wanted a fresh start somewhere Dad wouldn't know to find me. I found a nice place closer to the school where Marcus taught 5th grade. As I signed the lease, I felt this weird sense of freedom. This was the first big decision I'd made without worrying about what Dad would think or if he'd try to interfere somehow. That same day, Tom sent Dad an official notice withdrawing from the boat deal. Tom sliding into those DMS with receipts like a true MVP, while Dad's out here treating his daughter's savings like his personal ATM. The marina drama just got real interesting, folks. He also sent me 5 years worth of text messages where Dad had discussed different schemes to get money from family members. There were detailed plans about fake emergencies, investment opportunities that didn't exist, and ways to guilt relatives into loans. That night, I started packing my apartment. I'd decided to move closer to work and away from all the places that reminded me of Dad's constant interference. The secondhand couch I'd bought 3 years ago still had the receipt taped underneath because Dad had mocked me for buying used furniture when I could have asked him for money. I pulled out the art supplies from my closet that I'd finally bought myself at 22 after years of Dad saying creative hobbies were a waste of money. Each paintbrush and sketch pad represented a small victory over his voice in my head, telling me I was being stupid with my finances. The kitchen table wobbled when I took it apart because I'd bought the cheapest one I could find, always saving money for emergencies since I never knew when Dad might drain my accounts again. Around midnight, Mom called me crying. She'd been going through more of Dad's papers and found something that made her sick. He'd opened 3 credit cards in my name when I was in college, maxed them out to $12,000, then paid them off just enough to avoid detection. The accounts had damaged my credit score for years, and I'd never understood why I kept getting rejected for apartments and car loans. She sent me photos of the statements she'd found hidden in his filing cabinet. The next morning, Marcus picked me up and we drove to Derek's house. We'd decided it was time to tell Grandma everything. She'd been sending Dad money every month, thinking she was helping with medical bills that didn't exist. We sat in her living room while Marcus showed her the evidence on his laptop. Derek held her hand as she looked at bank statements showing Dad had taken over $20,000 from her retirement savings in the past 3 years. She started crying and kept saying she should have known better, but he was her son and she wanted to believe him. Marcus and I spent the rest of the day helping me move into my new apartment. As we carried boxes up the stairs, he told me he'd been seeing a therapist for 2 years to deal with Dad's manipulation. He handed me a business card and said the counselor specialized in financial abuse within families. He admitted he still struggled with guilt guilt about cutting Dad off financially, even though he knew it was the right thing to do. 2 days later, Sophia called me laughing. Dad had filed a civil lawsuit against me for theft and defamation, seeking $50,000 in damages. She read parts of the filing out loud, and it was full of obvious lies, like claiming I'd stolen money from accounts that never existed. She said she was preparing a countersuit for harassment and credit fraud that would make his lawyer drop him as a client. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing the therapist Marcus recommended. In my first session, I sat on her couch and couldn't stop crying as I explained how guilty I felt for taking the money, even though it included what he'd stolen from me. She handed me tissues and asked me to describe all the times Dad had taken money from me as a child. Mom and I met for coffee at a small place downtown. She kept apologizing for not protecting me from Dad's financial abuse when I was younger. She admitted she'd been scared of him too, always walking on eggshells and never knowing what would set him off. We both cried when she told me about the times she'd tried to hide money for me, but he always found it. A week later, Sophia called with more news. The family lawyer had found records showing Dad had been claiming me as a dependent on his taxes for the past 3 years. He'd been getting thousands in refunds while I struggled to pay my own taxes, and even had to set up payment plans with the IRS. This was straight up tax fraud, and the lawyer was adding it to our growing pile of evidence. Then my cousin texted me a photo of Dad at the casino downtown, playing the high-stakes poker tables. The local news picked up the story about Dad's lawsuit, and a reporter called asking for my side. After talking to Sophia, I agreed to do an interview and brought copies of all the documentation. The reporter's eyes got wider as I showed her the credit card fraud, the tax fraud, and the messages where Dad planned to scam family members. The story aired that Tuesday night. I watched it from Grace's couch while she held my hand. Seeing the reporter call it financial abuse instead of family drama made something shift inside me. For the first time, I stopped second-guessing myself about taking that money back. Grace squeezed my hand when the segment ended and told me she was proud of me for standing up to him. 3 days later, I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment when I found an old shoebox stuffed with birthday cards from over the years. I sat on the floor and started going through them, most from aunts and grandparents with normal messages. Then I found the ones from Bob. The card from my 8th birthday had a $5 bill taped inside with "Don't spend it all in one place" written in his handwriting. My 12th birthday card said "Hope you're saving wisely," with no money at all. The one from when I turned 16 said "Money management starts young," with a $10 check that I remembered him taking back the next day. Every single card had some comment about money or spending or saving. I took photos of all of them and sent them to Marcus, who called me right away to say he had similar ones. While we were on the phone, my aunt called on the other line. She'd seen the news story and wanted to tell me about the time Bob borrowed $3,000 from her for a medical emergency that never existed. Then my cousin texted saying Bob had taken $5,000 from him for a business investment that went nowhere. Within 2 days, 3 more relatives reached out with their own stories. Bob's brother Derek called and told me Bob had stolen $20,000 from their mother's estate when she died. A family friend messaged me on Facebook about a $10,000 loan Bob never paid back. We started a group text and added up all the amounts. The total came to over $100,000 taken from family and friends over 30 years. Sophia called me that afternoon with updates. She'd filed the countersuit against Bob for the credit fraud, the tax issues, and emotional distress. She also filed for a restraining order based on his threatening voicemail and showing up at my work. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. She told me to document everything and keep all the messages from family members as evidence. 2 weeks passed, and I threw myself into work to keep my mind off everything. I stayed late every night working on a new project for a major client. My supervisor pulled me aside one morning and mentioned how impressed she was with my dedication. She said there was a promotion opening up and I should apply. She also mentioned that Bob calling the office had actually made everyone more protective of me. The security team knew my situation now and wouldn't let him near the building. Human Resources had documented everything in case we needed it for court. That same week, Derek called me with disturbing news. He'd been at a family gathering and heard Bob telling everyone that I was mentally unstable. Bob claimed Marcus was manipulating me and turning me against the family. He said I'd always been troubled and now I was having some kind of breakdown. Several relatives believed him because he could be so convincing when he wanted to be. Derek recorded part of it on his phone and sent it to me. I forwarded everything to Sophia. My therapist appointment that week was hard. She helped me see how Bob had trained me since childhood to think his theft was normal. Every time he took my money, he made it seem like I was wrong for wanting to keep it. She had me write down all the times I could remember him taking money or making me feel guilty about having any. The list filled 3 pages. She explained this was financial abuse and it was designed to keep me dependent and confused. I started journaling every night about my memories and feelings. Marcus and I started having dinner with our grandmother every Wednesday. She'd cut Bob off completely after hearing about everything. She changed her will too and made sure he couldn't access any of her accounts. During one dinner, she told us stories about Bob as a kid. He used to take toys from other children and claim they were gifts. He'd steal lunch money and blame others. She said she tried to get him help, but he learned to hide it better as he got older. Tom called me the following week and asked to meet in person. We met at a coffee shop and he looked nervous. He told me he'd been going through the books at the dealership where Bob worked. Small amounts had been going missing for years, always with explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. A customer payment that was recorded wrong, a parts order that got duplicated, cash deposits that were short. Tom had documented everything and taken it to the owner. An internal audit was starting and Bob's job was hanging by a thread. Tom gave me copies of everything he'd found. Meanwhile, Linda's divorce lawyer was digging into their finances. She subpoenaed 10 years of bank records and credit card statements. The pattern was clear once you looked at it all together. Bob had been moving money between accounts to hide his spending. He'd open credit cards in Linda's name and max them out. He'd take loans against their house without telling her. They'd been living beyond their means for years, all funded by money stolen from family members. Linda sent me copies of everything her lawyer found. That night, I sat in my new apartment staring at my bank balance on my laptop. Why does Tom just happen to have access to all those dealership records right when they need them? The timing of everyone suddenly finding evidence feels oddly convenient. Linda's Linda's divorce lawyer, Tom's audit, relatives coming forward all at once after that news story aired. For the first time in my life, I knew my money was actually safe, but I still checked the account 5 times a day. I'd wake up at night and grab my phone to make sure the balance was still there. I couldn't shake the feeling that it would disappear. 3 weeks before the court date, Sophia called me at work, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Bob's lawyer had sent over a settlement offer that morning. Bob would drop his lawsuit if I returned the extra $2,000 and signed an NDA about our family finances. Sophia had already typed up her response, which was just one word in bold letters. Numbers. She faxed it back within the hour, and we both knew this would make him angrier. 2 days later, Tom called me during my lunch break with news that made my hands shake. The dealership had finished their audit and found Bob had stolen around $30,000 over 5 years. They fired him that morning and were talking to the police about pressing charges. Tom said Bob had screamed at the managers that I'd ruined his reputation and made him desperate enough to steal. The next weekend, Marcus picked me up early, and we drove to our childhood home while Linda was at her sister's house. We needed to find more financial documents for Sophia, and the garage seemed like the best place to start. Box after box of old school projects sat stacked against the walls, things Bob always claimed meant so much to him. Marcus opened the first box and found my third-grade art project sitting on top of receipts for a boat motor from 10 years ago. Every single box was the same, our childhood memories used as hiding spots for receipts he didn't want Linda to see. We took pictures of everything and loaded the receipts into my car. That week, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. Aunt Carol apologized for calling me selfish and admitted Bob had borrowed $500 from her last year for car repairs, but bought a new TV instead. Uncle Pete said he'd loaned Bob $2,000 for medical bills that turned out to be fake. Cousin Amy had given him money for Dad's supposed emergency surgery that never happened. They all saw the pattern now, how Bob always had a crisis, but never got better no matter how much help he got. Thursday night around 10:30, I was getting ready for bed when my apartment intercom started buzzing. The screen showed someone at the main entrance, but I couldn't see their face in the dark. Then I heard Bob's voice through the speaker claiming he was delivering food and needed someone to let him in. My stomach dropped as I watched him buzz apartment after apartment until someone on the 3rd floor opened the door. I grabbed my phone and locked my deadbolt while calling 911. The operator stayed on the line as I pushed my couch against the door. I could hear Bob's footsteps in the hallway getting closer, and then he was pounding on my door yelling that we needed to talk. The police arrived within 8 minutes, and I watched through my peephole as they put him in handcuffs. Sophia had gotten me a restraining order 2 weeks earlier, and Bob had just violated it. The next morning, his mugshot was on the local news website with a story about the financial abuse case. My email inbox filled up with messages from strangers who'd found the article and wanted to share their own stories about parents who stole from them. One woman said her mom had taken her college fund. Another said his dad had maxed out credit cards in his name. Reading their messages made me realize how many people dealt with this, but never talked about it. I took Friday off work, and Grace drove us to Hocking Hills for a hike. We walked for 3 hours and didn't mention Bob once, just talked about her new job and the guy she was dating. At the top of the trail, I sat on a rock and felt something shift in my chest. The worst was almost over, and I was still here, still standing. Monday morning, Sophia called with news that made her laugh out loud. Bob's lawyer had withdrawn from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. Bob had decided to represent himself in court, which Sophia said would make him more unpredictable but much weaker legally. She'd seen it before with clients who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Linda's divorce lawyer sent over more discoveries that week, including credit card statements we'd never seen. Bob had been going to the casino 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes losing $1,000 in a single night. The statements showed cash advances at casino ATMs totaling thousands every month. Linda had no idea because Bob handled all their finances and told her they were broke. This explained where all the stolen money went, why he always needed more no matter how much he took. The night before court, I couldn't eat dinner, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Bob's face at my door, heard him pounding and yelling. Marcus showed up at 9 with a pizza and his sleeping bag. He set himself up on my couch and turned on a movie, not saying much, but just being there. Around midnight, I finally fell asleep, knowing I wasn't alone in this anymore. The alarm went off at 6, and my stomach immediately twisted into knots. Marcus was already up making coffee, and he pushed a mug into my hands without saying anything. We drove to the courthouse in silence, and I kept checking my phone, even though I knew Sophia would meet us there. The building looked bigger than I remembered, and my legs felt weak walking up those stone steps. Sophia was waiting by the security checkpoint wearing a sharp gray suit, and she squeezed my shoulder as we went through the metal detectors. The courtroom was on the 3rd floor, and when the elevator doors opened, I saw him immediately. Bob stood near the windows in a navy suit that made my chest tighten because I recognized it from 3 years ago when he'd bought it with money he claimed was for my college textbooks. He turned when he heard us and started walking toward me with this fake concerned expression. Sophia stepped between us before he got close and told him any communication needed to go through counsel. His jaw clenched, but he backed off, and that's when I noticed Derek sitting on a bench near the door. Tom was there too, looking uncomfortable in his worn blazer. Linda sat on the opposite side of the room and wouldn't look at Bob at all. The bailiff called us in, and we took our seats at separate tables. Bob kept trying to catch my eye, but I stared at the wood grain on the table in front of me. The judge entered, and we all stood and then sat again when she told us to. Bob's lawyer went first and started painting this picture of a loving father who was just trying to protect his daughter from bad financial decisions. Bob nodded along like he was in church listening to a sermon about himself. When it was Bob's turn to testify, he stood up and smoothed his tie before walking to the witness stand. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth with this solemn expression that almost made me laugh. His lawyer asked him about the money transfers, and Bob leaned forward like he was sharing something important. He said I'd been confused about money since I was little, and that taking it was his responsibility as a parent. The judge interrupted and asked him to explain what parental compensation meant. Bob's eyes lit up like someone had finally asked the right question. He launched into this speech about how children owe their parents for the sacrifice of raising them, and how keeping their money money safe was actually doing them a favor. He said the $8,000 was nothing compared to what he'd spent on me over the years, and that I should be grateful he only took what was rightfully his. The judge's eyebrows went up, but she let him keep talking. Bob explained that children don't understand the value of money, and parents have to make hard choices to teach them lessons. He said every penny I'd ever earned belonged to him anyway, since he'd given me life and a roof over my head. His lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand with the folder of evidence Sophia had prepared. My voice shook at first, but got stronger as I went through each document chronologically. I showed the bank statements from when I was 10 and the paper trail of every time money disappeared. When I got to the part about my bike money being gone, I felt my throat close up. I tried to keep going, but tears started falling, and I couldn't stop them. The judge called a 15-minute recess, and I saw Bob roll his eyes like I was being dramatic. Even the few relatives who'd come to support him looked away from him then. After the break, Derek took the stand and started talking about their grandmother's estate. He explained how Bob had convinced her to change her will right before she died, and how the money meant for all the grandkids went straight to Bob instead. Bob jumped up and shouted that Derek was a jealous failure who'd never amounted to anything. The judge slammed her gavel and told Bob to sit down or be held in contempt. Bob's face turned red, but he sat back down, muttering under his breath. Tom went next and laid out the whole embezzlement situation at their company. He had receipts and emails showing Bob had taken money meant for equipment and used it for personal expenses, including that boat he'd bought. Bob stood up again, claiming Tom was part of a conspiracy to destroy him. The judge warned him this was his last chance before contempt charges. Bob pointed at Tom and called him a backstabber, but sat down when the bailiff stepped toward him. Linda's testimony was the hardest to watch. She pulled out credit card statements showing accounts Bob had opened in my name when I was 18. She explained how she'd found them hidden in his desk, along with forged signatures on loan applications. Bob lost it completely and called her a vindictive witch who was poisoning everyone against him. Bob's grand courtroom performance, where he claims kids owe parents for being born, is truly something special. Nothing says loving father quite like telling a judge your daughter should pay you back for existing. The judge immediately held him in contempt and ordered the bailiffs to detain him. They put him in handcuffs right there in the courtroom and led him to a holding room. During the recess, while Bob was detained, the judge reviewed all the evidence we'd submitted. I sat with Marcus and Linda and Derek and Grace, who'd come to support me. Tom sat behind us, and for the first time, I saw how Bob had hurt all of us in different ways. We weren't just random victims, but a group of people who'd finally broken free from his manipulation. When court resumed, Bob was brought back in, still in handcuffs, and made to sit quietly. The judge took 20 minutes going through her decision point by point. She dismissed Bob's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning he could never file it again. She granted my countersuit entirely and ordered Bob to pay me $25,000 in damages, plus all my legal fees. The restraining order was extended for 3 years, and she added a provision that Bob couldn't contact me through third parties either. Bob tried to stand up when she read the amount, but the bailiffs held him down. His face went purple, and he started yelling about corruption and how everyone was against him. The judge added another contempt charge and ordered him removed from the courtroom. They basically dragged him out while he screamed about his rights. Walking out of the courthouse, I thought I'd feel happy or relieved, but mostly I just felt empty. Marcus put his arm around me and said feeling weird about holding an abusive parent accountable was normal. He reminded me the victory wasn't about defeating Bob, but about protecting myself from future harm. We went to lunch, but I barely ate anything and went home to sleep for 14 hours straight. A week later, Sophia called to tell me Bob's former employer had decided to press criminal charges for embezzlement. The prosecutor wanted me to testify as a character witness about Bob's pattern of theft going back to my childhood. I agreed, even though I knew it might mean Bob would actually go to jail this time. The next week, I started seeing a therapist again because the whole trial thing was messing with my head more than I expected. I sat in her office staring at the tissue box while she asked me questions about growing up with Bob, and I kept remembering all these little moments where he'd taken my money and made me feel crazy for being upset about it. She pointed out that every time he stole from me, it wasn't really about the money, but about making sure I never felt secure enough to leave or stand up to him. 3 days later, I got home from work and found a thick envelope from some lawyer I'd never heard of, and when I opened it, there was a handwritten letter from Bob talking about how he remembered teaching me to ride a bike and taking me to get ice cream, and how could I do this to my own father after everything we'd been through together. He wrote that he was the real victim here, and that I'd destroyed his life over a simple misunderstanding about money that families should handle privately. I didn't write back, but I scanned the whole thing and sent it to Sophia, who said it was classic manipulation and we should keep it for the trial. The criminal trial started 2 weeks later, and the courthouse was packed with people from Bob's work and some relatives I hadn't seen in years. When they called me to testify, I had to walk past Bob sitting at the defendant's table, and he stared at me the whole time like he was trying to burn holes through my head. The prosecutor asked me about the bike money when I was 10, and the babysitting money, and the art supply money, and I told them everything while Bob's lawyer kept objecting and saying it wasn't relevant. Then other people testified, including Tom, who talked about missing money from their business accounts, and a woman from Bob's church who said he'd borrowed $5,000 for a medical emergency that never existed. The whole thing took 3 days, and by the end, the prosecutor had shown that Bob had stolen over $70,000 from different people over the past 15 years. Meanwhile, Linda's divorce was moving forward, and she called me crying one night because she'd found 3 credit cards in Bob's name that were maxed out with almost $40,000 in gambling debt that she never knew about. The divorce got finalized a month later, and she got the house plus half of what was left after the debts were paid, which wasn't much, but at least she was free. She told me she was going back to school to finish her nursing degree, that she'd quit when she married Bob because he said they didn't need 2 incomes. At work, my boss pulled me aside and said she'd been watching how I handled everything with grace and professionalism, even when Bob was calling the office trying to get me fired, and she was promoting me to senior analyst with a 20% raise. I realized that Bob trying to destroy my career had actually made people see how strong I was and respect me more. 2 months after the trial started, Bob was found guilty of embezzlement and fraud, and the judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison. Plus, he had to pay back everyone he'd stolen from, though nobody expected to see that money. When the bailiff put the handcuffs on him, Bob turned to me and yelled that I'd destroyed our family, and I'd regret this for the rest of my life. But I just sat there thinking he still couldn't admit he'd done anything wrong. A week after the sentencing, I started a support group for people who'd been financially abused by their parents, because I'd looked online and couldn't find anything specific to that situation. 12 people showed up to the first meeting at the community center, and we went around the room sharing our stories, and every single person had been told they were selfish or ungrateful for wanting control of their own money. One woman cried when she talked about her mom stealing her college fund, and another guy said his dad had taken out credit cards in his name when he was 18 and ruined his credit for years. Marcus came with me to help our grandmother sort through her finances because we'd found out Bob had been managing some of her accounts, and we wanted to make sure everything was secure. Derek helped us set up new accounts and passwords, and we discovered Bob had been slowly moving money from her savings into an account only he could access, but we caught it before he could take too much. Grandma changed her will that day to cut Bob out completely and thanked us for showing her who he really was, even though it hurt to accept that her son was a thief. A few weeks later, I got a letter forwarded from my old apartment from a cousin I hadn't talked to since high school, and she wrote that her parents had been about to lend Bob $20,000 for some emergency surgery he claimed he needed, but after hearing my story, they realized it was probably a scam. She said they'd noticed the same patterns I described and were grateful I'd been brave enough to speak up about what he'd done. That afternoon, I went to deposit my first bonus check at the bank, and my hands were shaking the whole time because part of me still expected to log in later and find my account empty, even though Bob was in prison and couldn't touch my money anymore. The teller asked if I was okay, and I said yes, but really, I was thinking about how Bob had trained me my whole life to not trust that my money was really mine, and how that fear might never completely go away. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me at work and said I needed to check the family group chat right away because something had happened with Bob's prison calls. I opened my phone and saw Derek had posted a recording from the prison phone system where Bob was talking to his old friend from high school, and Bob was saying he took my $8,000 because he deserved it for all the years he raised me and fed me and kept a roof over my head. The recording was crystal clear, and Bob kept going on about how ungrateful I was and how kids these days don't understand that parents are owed payback for raising them. Within minutes, everyone in the family chat was responding with shock and anger because Bob had been telling them for months that he never took my money and I was making everything up. My aunt, who had defended him, posted that she was done with him forever, and my cousin said he finally understood why I did what I did. The recording spread through the extended family like wildfire, and by that evening, Bob had lost every single person who still supported him. 6 months after the trial ended, I walked into the car dealership with my checkbook and bought the Honda Civic I'd been saving for when this whole mess started. The salesman ran my credit and everything checked out, and when I signed the papers, my hand was steady this time because I knew Bob couldn't touch this money from prison. I sat in the driver's seat of my new car and remembered being 10 years old counting quarters and dimes in that jar for my bike, and how Bob had taken it all, and now here I was at 25, finally able to buy something without worrying it would disappear. The support group I started had grown from 5 people to 30 members who met every Wednesday night at the community center, and we'd developed a whole packet of resources about recognizing financial abuse and protecting yourself legally. People drove from 2 hours away to attend and share their stories about parents who stole their college funds or emptied their bank accounts or took out credit cards in their names. One woman said our group saved her life because she finally understood she wasn't crazy or ungrateful for wanting to keep her own money. Linda called me one afternoon to tell me about her new boyfriend James, who actually showed her his bank statements without her asking and split every dinner bill fairly and never made her feel guilty for buying herself new clothes. She said it was weird being with someone who didn't hide receipts or lie about money or make her feel stupid for asking questions about finances. Bob's recording from prison where he flat out admits he took the money because parents deserve payback for raising their kids. That's interesting timing. He's already convicted but still can't help himself from confessing on a recorded line while claiming innocence to everyone else. She was learning what normal looked like after 26 years with Bob. That December, Marcus and I decided to start our own holiday tradition with just us, our grandmother, and Grace at my apartment, instead of the big family gatherings where Bob used to hold court and make everyone uncomfortable. We cooked together and played board games, and nobody made nasty comments about money or criticized anyone's life choices, and Grace said it was the first family holiday she'd seen where nobody ended up crying. Almost exactly 1 year after everything started, Bob got released early for good behavior, but within 3 days, he had his friend Carl call me to say Bob wanted to meet and work things out. The parole officer said that counted as third-party contact, which violated his parole terms, and Bob got sent back to finish his full sentence plus extra time for the violation. He still wouldn't accept that boundaries meant something. I posted a 1-year update on social media about everything that had happened, and within hours, it had thousands of shares and hundreds of comments from people sharing their own stories about parents who stole from them. My inbox filled with messages from kids whose parents emptied their piggy banks, and teenagers whose parents took their job money, and adults whose parents still felt entitled to their paychecks. I realized this was bigger than just my story. By that point, I'd saved enough to start looking at houses and met with a financial advisor who helped me invest some of my money in index funds and showed me how to build credit properly. For the first time in my life, I was planning 5 years ahead instead of just hoping my money would still be there tomorrow. Derek called me one night absolutely furious because he'd been going through our grandmother's papers to help her with taxes and found documents showing Bob had forged signatures to access her late husband's life insurance payout 15 years ago. The statute of limitations meant we couldn't prosecute, but Derek said it all made sense now why Bob always had money for toys he wanted, but claimed the family was too broke for Marcus to go to college. The final restitution check came in the mail 14 months after I first discovered my $8,000 missing from my account. The court had ordered Bob's wages garnished and his assets seized, and the check was for the full amount, plus interest and damages. I deposited it at the same bank where I'd been shaking with fear, and this time I felt nothing but relief because it was finally over, and I'd gotten back everything he took from me, plus more. 6 months later, I stood at a podium in front of 300 people at the Columbus Financial Abuse Awareness Conference. My hands gripped the edges as I told them about the bike money and the camping trip and the $8,000. I explained how family theft wasn't just drama, but actual crime that destroyed trust and futures. People nodded, and some wiped their eyes, and afterwards dozens came up to share their own stories. Marcus drove down from Cleveland to hear me speak, and afterwards we sat in my car in the parking garage. He told me he was proud of me for doing what he never could when Bob took his college fund 20 years ago. We talked about having kids someday and making sure they'd never know that kind of betrayal. A week later, Linda mailed me a letter Bob had written from prison, asking for forgiveness and blaming his childhood and stress and everything except himself. I read it once, then fed it through the shredder at work while my coworker watched. The support group I'd started met every Tuesday at the library, and 18 months after Bob stole my money, we filed the paperwork to become an official nonprofit. We had 40 regular members and a website where people shared resources about recognizing financial abuse. Grace and I went to dinner at our favorite Thai place, and she mentioned how I didn't check my phone for bank alerts anymore. She was right, because the constant fear had finally faded after months of therapy and legal protection. The notification came through email that Bob was being released early for good behavior and moving to Arizona to live with his cousin. I read it calmly, then deleted it because he couldn't touch my accounts anymore, and the restraining order was still active. A woman named Sarah joined our support group, and I sat with her at the police station while she filed reports about her mother stealing her disability checks. I held her hand through the paperwork the same way Grace had held mine. My bank statement showed $32,000 saved in just 1 year without Bob's constant theft and sabotage. At my cousin's wedding, the aunts who had called me selfish came up one by one to apologize. Uncle Derek pulled me aside and said my courage had helped him finally cut Bob off after years of loans. I sat in my new condo's spare bedroom that I'd turned into an office preparing handouts for Tuesday's meeting. My phone buzzed with the automatic transfer notification, and I swiped it away without looking at the amount. The money was there, and it was mine, and nobody could take it ever again. I opened my laptop to work on our nonprofit's grant application, while sunlight streamed through the window I'd bought with my own money in my own home. The shredded pieces of Bob's letter were long gone, but I kept the court documents in a folder labeled Victory next to my savings account statements. Everything I'd built in the past 2 years was mine, and protected and growing every single day without fear. Thanks for letting me give the play-by-play on this wild ride. You definitely made it twice as fun. Catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.